In just 30 seconds, Dorian Yates dismantled a PhD with words sharper than any rep, and left the entire fitness world speechless. What made it even more shocking wasn't the volume of his voice or the anger in his tone. It was the calm, that cold, unshakable composure that only comes from a man who's already proven everything he ever needed to. For those who don't know, Dorian Yates isn't just another retired bodybuilder. He's the Shadow, six-time Mr. Olympia, the man who changed what mass meant in the 1990s. A silent storm who rarely spoke, but when he did, his words hit harder than his workouts. And then there's Dr. Mike, the modern fitness intellectual. A PhD in sports physiology, co-founder of Renaissance Periodization, and one of the loudest advocates for evidence-based training. His world revolves around data, research, and spreadsheets, everything Dorian built his empire without. So when the old-school legend and the new-age scientist collided, it wasn't just a disagreement about training methods. It was two entire philosophies crashing into each other. Instinct versus evidence, blood versus data, experience versus academia. And when the data-driven doctor poked the quiet monster of the 1990s, he learned the hard way that some legends don't need to shout to destroy you. It all started when Dr. Mike decided to take aim at one of bodybuilding's most polarizing figures, Mike Mentzer. In a video that quickly went viral, Mike didn't just critique Mentzer's high-intensity training philosophy. He tore it apart. He called it outdated, psychotic, and backward, suggesting that Mentzer's ideas belonged to a bygone era, one where guesswork ruled over evidence. To most people, that might sound like a fair academic critique. But in the world of bodybuilding, Mentzer isn't just some old name. He's a symbol. His minimalist, all-or-nothing training style didn't just influence a generation, it shaped champions. And one of the biggest believers in that method was none other than Dorian Yates, the six-time Mr. Olympia who built one of the most fearsome physiques the world had ever seen. So when Mike dismissed Mentzer's methods as madness, he wasn't just talking about an old training book. He was indirectly taking a shot at the very foundation that made Dorian Yates a legend. Then came the moment that flipped the internet. Mike compared himself directly to Mentzer. "I'm bigger, stronger, and more educated," he said, casually putting himself above one of the sport's most respected icons. He claimed it wasn't arrogance, just fact, that he lived in a more advanced era with more knowledge and better tools. But that didn't make the statement any less explosive. The audience reaction was instant and divided. Some fans admired his confidence and logic, applauding him for bringing science into a world often driven by ego and tradition. Others were stunned by what they saw as pure disrespect, a modern influencer comparing himself to a man who helped define the golden age of bodybuilding. But the one man who actually proved Mentzer's methods on stage wasn't impressed. When Dorian Yates saw Mike's video, he didn't roll his eyes and move on. He quietly decided to respond. But unlike most modern influencers who thrive on outrage and clickbait, Dorian didn't rush to post a fiery rant or clap back on social media. He didn't need to. He's Dorian Yates, the six-time Mr. Olympia, who let his silence speak louder than most men's words. So when he finally did speak, the tone caught everyone off guard. No yelling, no ego, no theatrics. Just the kind of cold, unshakable composure that can only come from a man who has already conquered everything there is to conquer. He didn't sound like someone trying to win an argument. He sounded like someone explaining reality. Calm, collected, but absolutely devastating. When Dorian speaks, the industry listens because he built a physique no spreadsheet ever could. In an era before algorithms, recovery trackers, and optimization charts, Dorian crafted his legendary body in the blood and chalk of a dark Birmingham gym. He didn't just talk about high-intensity training, he lived it. He bled for it. Every rep was a war. Every set was a risk. Every injury a reminder that he was chasing something no study could quantify: the human limit. That's what made his response so powerful. He wasn't speaking from theory or textbooks, he was speaking from scars. To him, this wasn't about defending Mike Mentzer as a person. It was about defending a philosophy, a way of life that built champions long before evidence-based became the buzzword of the fitness world. Dorian explained that yes, he was influenced by Mentzer, but influence doesn't mean imitation. He didn't just follow the heavy-duty system, he evolved it. He took the skeleton of Mentzer's training ideas and rebuilt them through experience, testing, tweaking, and molding them until they became something greater. What Mentzer started as theory, Dorian turned into dominance. He used short, intense sessions not because they were trendy, but because they worked, proven by his results on the Olympia stage year after year. He trained to failure not to look hardcore, but because he believed true growth lives on the edge of pain. He didn't care what studies said about optimal volume. He cared about what his body showed him after years of trial, error, and relentless focus. So when Dorian heard a so-called scientist mock the very foundation of his success, dismissing Mentzer's ideas as psychotic and backward, he didn't lash out in anger. He didn't lower himself to petty insults. Instead, he did what he's always done best. He analyzed. He dissected the argument piece by piece, stripping away ego and exposing the gap between theoretical knowledge and lived experience. And that's what made his response sting so deeply. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. The kind of calm that cuts far deeper than rage ever could. Because when Dorian Yates enters the chat, it's not to make noise. It's to remind the world that greatness doesn't need validation from science, only proof in the mirror. To be fair, Mike didn't pull his argument out of thin air. His breakdown of Mike Mentzer's training wasn't all insults. It was part logic, part arrogance. He admitted that Mentzer had a few brilliant ideas: short, focused workouts, pushing close to failure, and maximizing recovery. But in Mike's view, those ideas didn't stand the test of time. By the late 1980s, he argued, everything Mentzer had preached had already been tested, filtered, and either validated or discarded by the bodybuilding community. In other words, Mike believed the Mentzer philosophy had already served its purpose. What worked was absorbed into mainstream training. What didn't was left behind. He described Mentzer's one-set-to-failure style as more of a fad, appealing to those who like simplicity, or in some cases, laziness. His tone suggested that anyone still following those ideas was living in the past, clinging to nostalgia rather than progress. To Mike, this wasn't disrespect, it was logic. He was simply stating what he saw as the truth. Science had moved on. The world had better data, better tools, and more understanding of training variables than Mentzer could ever have dreamed of. But then came Dorian's rebuttal, the one line that sliced through all the academic polish and landed like a knockout punch. That might be true on paper, but the gym isn't paper. That was the essence of Dorian Yates. While Mike's world revolved around studies, spreadsheets, and peer-reviewed conclusions, Dorian's world was made of iron, sweat, and pain. His data came from the mirror, not the lab. His research was written in blood and scar tissue. Dorian's philosophy was simple but profound. Bodybuilding isn't about theories, it's about results. You can't quantify grit, hunger, or obsession in a research paper. You can't replicate the intensity of a man pushing himself to absolute failure in a sterile lab setting. To Dorian, knowledge without experience is just noise, and in the gym, noise doesn't move weight. Mike had studies, Dorian had scars, and in bodybuilding, scars tell the real story. And that's where things got personal. When Dorian finally delivered his response, it was like watching a master surgeon operate. Precise, measured, and absolutely devastating. There was no shouting, no emotional outburst, just cold, undeniable truth. And it started with one of the most savage openers in bodybuilding history. Either you're blind or you're crazy. That's how Dorian addressed Dr. Mike's self-comparison to Mike Mentzer. He couldn't believe that someone who looked the way Mike did would seriously compare himself to a legend whose physique helped redefine an entire era. Dorian's tone wasn't angry, it was disappointed. The kind of tone a champion uses when he sees arrogance replacing self-awareness. Then came the line that set the internet on fire. A sentence that will probably follow Mike for the rest of his career. A bag of crap that gets bigger is still a bigger bag of crap. It was brutal. Ruthless. But it wasn't just an insult. It was a lesson wrapped in humiliation. Dorian was pointing out something that a lot of people in the fitness world quietly think but rarely say. You can't inject your way into greatness. You can't compensate for lack of aesthetic balance or artistry with bugs and data. Dorian questioned why someone so outspoken about performance-enhancing drugs, who openly admits that his usage might take a decade off his life, still looked, in Dorian's words, nothing like a champion. To him, Mike's reliance on science and PEDs made him a perfect example of the modern fitness paradox. People doing everything by the book, yet missing the soul of the sport. For Dorian, this wasn't about who had the better muscles. It was about what those muscles meant. He wasn't impressed by degrees, credentials, or scientific jargon. His entire career was proof that results speak louder than research. And when that clip hit the internet, chaos erupted. Fans flooded comment sections, calling it the calmest execution ever. Others said he ended him politely. Within hours, reels, shorts, and remixes spread across every platform. Dorian Yates' calm takedown became the new gold standard for destroying someone without ever raising your voice. But this wasn't just about two lifters, it was a war of philosophies. This entire exchange became more than a disagreement. It became the perfect snapshot of a much bigger war in the fitness world. Science versus experience. On one side, you have Mike, the professor of hypertrophy, armed with studies, data sets, and controlled training variables. To him, progress is a formula. Everything from volume to recovery can be predicted, tracked, and optimized. His approach appeals to the modern generation. Lifters who want precision, guarantees, and the comfort of science to tell them they're doing it right. On the other side, you have Dorian Yates, a man who didn't need a spreadsheet to understand the human body. His training wasn't about tracking, it was about feeling. Pain, fatigue, intensity. Those were his data points. He didn't need a heart rate monitor to know when to stop. His limits were found under a barbell, not inside a lab. Dorian represents an era built on instinct, not algorithms. He trained until failure wasn't just physical, it was psychological. His workouts were short, brutal, and efficient because they had to be. There were no luxury recovery systems, no online programs, no science-based templates, just pure raw experimentation guided by intuition and obsession. That's what separates the two worlds. Mike's generation seeks safety through precision, measuring everything to avoid mistakes. Dorian's generation became legends by making mistakes and surviving them. For him, pain wasn't a red flag, it was feedback. And that difference, that divide, is what defines the gap between academia and experience. The truth is, both sides have value. Science helps refine the process. But Dorian's calm counterattack carried a timeless warning. The body doesn't read studies, it responds to effort. Because in the gym, your results don't care how much research you've read, they care how much pain you're willing to endure. But Dorian didn't stop at defending Mentzer. He exposed something deeper about today's so-called evidence-based culture. As Dorian continued, his words shifted from a personal response to a full-blown critique of the modern fitness industry. He wasn't just addressing Dr. Mike anymore, he was addressing an entire generation of lifters who, in his eyes, have lost touch with what real training means. His message was sharp and unfiltered. People hide behind science to avoid discomfort. According to Dorian, too many lifters today use research as a shield. They quote studies, analyze graphs, and debate training volume online, all while avoiding the one thing that truly matters: effort. The obsession with being evidence-based has ironically become a way to justify never pushing hard enough. Lifters would rather calculate than suffer. They'd rather discuss intensity than feel it. That's where Dorian took aim at what he called the lazy lifter appeal. He said people are drawn to simple, watered-down ideas not because they're effective, but because they sound easy. The mentality of one set to failure or minimal training for maximum results feels appealing to those who don't want to think, plan, or sweat. It sounds hardcore, but it's often an excuse for mediocrity. Then came his subtle but devastating jab at the current state of fitness culture. Mentzer's back not because he was right, but because he's trending. That one line said it all. Dorian was calling out how nostalgia and aesthetics have replaced truth. In the 1980s, Mentzer was controversial because he challenged the status quo. In the 2020s, he's popular again not because people understand his system, but because his mustache, his black and white photos, and his rebellious attitude fit perfectly into TikTok's short-form mythology. It's no longer about what works, it's about what looks good. The 1980s were built on grit, dim gyms, heavy iron, and a mindset that worshipped progress through pain. The 2020s are built on virality, clean lighting, ring lights, and a worship of image over substance. Dorian's calm words exposed a painful truth. The fitness world has traded passion for performance and struggle for aesthetics. And that's when Dorian turned his calm critique into a mirror for the entire industry. What made Dorian's comments hit so hard wasn't just the words themselves, it was the contrast behind them. Humility versus arrogance, substance versus performance. Dorian didn't need to remind anyone of who he was. He didn't flash trophies or flex his resume. He didn't need to. His 6 Mr. Olympia titles, his granite-like physique, and his legacy spoke for him. That's what real authority sounds like. Quiet confidence built on results, not noise. Mike, on the other hand, fell into what Dorian subtly exposed as the ego trap. The fallacy of superiority. The belief that intelligence or credentials automatically make you better than those who came before you. Mike didn't mean to sound arrogant, but when he compared himself to Mentzer, saying he was bigger, stronger, and more educated, he stepped onto sacred ground without realizing it. The problem wasn't the logic, it was the tone. In bodybuilding, respect is currency, and comparing yourself to a legend who inspired generations comes off less like analysis and more like arrogance. Dorian saw that, and his calm dismantling of Mike's argument was less about defending Mentzer and more about protecting that code of respect. As one fan perfectly summed it up online, arguing with Dorian Yates about bodybuilding is like arguing with Michael Jordan about basketball. It's not just foolish, it's career. Dorian's calm response was more than a roast. It was a lesson in reverence for the craft, for the pain, and for the pioneers who built the path. And, in defending a dead man's honor, Dorian may have just redefined what respect means in this sport. Dorian Yates has always lived up to his nickname, the Shadow. He appears rarely, speaks even less, but every time he does, the entire bodybuilding world stops and listens. Throughout his career, he built his legend by emerging from obscurity, dominating the stage, and then disappearing just as quickly, leaving behind silence, mystery, and a legacy that no one could ignore. And now, decades after his final competition, nothing has changed. Even in 2023, Dorian can humble an entire generation with just a few sentences. He doesn't need to post daily, chase trends, or build an algorithm-friendly brand. One calm, calculated comment from him carries more weight than 1,000 fitness gurus shouting into their cameras. That's the power of authenticity, the power of a man whose legacy was built on action, not attention. There's something poetic about that. The man once called the Shadow is still casting one, a long, unshakable shadow that stretches over the modern fitness landscape. His presence reminds the new generation that no matter how advanced technology or science becomes, there's still something timeless about raw effort, discipline, and lived experience. The moment between Dorian and Mike wasn't just a clash of opinions, it was a lesson in legacy. It proved that experience, when paired with truth, still commands respect in a world obsessed with shortcuts. The old ways may not be perfect, but they're not dead, not while men like Dorian still speak. In the end, this wasn't just another internet feud. It was a wake-up call. Dr. Mike's arrogance collided with Dorian Yates' calm demolition, and the result was a reminder that in bodybuilding, trophies still beat textbooks. For all the data, degrees, and detailed training models, nothing speaks louder than a man who's proven his words with results carved into muscle and history. Dorian didn't need to shout. He didn't need to posture or debate. He simply reminded the world, through truth and composure, that real mastery isn't loud. It's lived. His legacy wasn't built on theories, but on the kind of experience that can't be simulated, downloaded, or quantified. It leaves us with one uncomfortable but necessary question. Has bodybuilding traded wisdom for Wi-Fi? Before you laugh at the old school legends, before you call their methods outdated or unscientific, ask yourself, could you survive their workouts? Could you endure their pain, their sacrifice, their decades of trial and error without the comfort of analytics and optimization? So now it's your turn. Drop a comment below. Are you team science or team experience? Do you side with data, or do you still believe in the power of sweat, instinct, and grit? Because in the war between data and dominance, Dorian Yates just proved one timeless truth. Silence can be the loudest roar.